Hello everyone, I'm Kathina Caleb. This is a video presentation on a UDL plan for EDAT 524 at George Mason University. Welcome. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today are the classroom observation that I did, explaining the learner profile, suggested material for UDL improvement, and supportive UDL guidelines. The class I observed was an online class. It is of a second grade mathematics class. And the objective of the lesson was to identify the model unit fractions as equal parts, a whole or set of numbers, read and write fractions with numbers and words, and discuss and exchange ideas about math. The entirety lesson was taught using the Smartboard here. This is Miss Ainge. She was very interactive, as you can see, with the children. She used sign language, called on students, and asked questions. And she provided the visuals there with the Smartboard. And she supported many UDL principles, but I felt the largest missing component to her lesson was in having the students supply their knowledge, which is part of the UDL guideline action and expression. So for this online classroom, I was not able to know the learner profiles. So this is the hypothetical profile that I came up with. They struggled in math. They're creative. They had some learner weaknesses, including a ESL and an ADHD student. They don't like to sit for long periods. Some preferences is that they'd like to be creative again and working in pairs. And their barrier that they faced was that within math, they struggled in math and understanding math and grasping the concept of math. So my material that I'll be presenting here for them in red addresses those areas that the material I'm going to present addresses those areas in red. Something I came up across through my line of work is the Montessori fraction skittles. These are a great foundational introduction for students who are learning fractions. So this material helps the children gain a visual understanding of fraction. It represents a whole, half, third, and fourth and fifth of a fraction. Utilizing a material like the fraction skittles would not only aid all learners, but provide that needed support for those special population students as well. So how does implementing something such as a fraction skittles do that? Fraction skittles represent or support UDL guidelines. The first UD guideline I'm going to talk about that the fraction skittles support is engagement. ESL and ADHD students are supported sensorially as well as visually. This can help both populations with staying focused as they are working with their hands as well as learning content through the visual materials rather than on language, since both struggle with language, ESL, the understanding of, and ADHD, with poor listening skills. The embedded control of error with Skittles being color-coded also provides an even greater support to those students, as it's a confidence booster for the students to be able to work independently without fear of failure. Cited as the learner's strength and preferences is also creativity, and the fraction Skittles by design, they allow the creative learner the flexibility to assemble the halves together in as many ways as they could think of. So very good also for the creative learners who like to just be open and play and mess around with them. So it's also good for that. And moving on to the guideline of representation, once again, the ESL and ADHD students, they're supported visually and sensorially, and the focus of the learning is not on language as much as it is on the visual representation of the language, so they can really focus on the content of it. And again, the control of error is beneficial for both students as they can anticipate and match each fraction by color and size. It also targets the existing barriers where students need additional help understanding fractions. This is really a concrete way for them to explore fractions, and so it doesn't make it so scary and abstract. It's very concrete and hands-on, so the students can really understand and grasp the meaning of what a fraction is. And lastly, the guideline of action inspection is, which mentioned earlier, is the largest component within Mrs. Ainge's lesson that I felt could be improved upon. Again, the fraction Skittles address the learner's strengths of the classroom with creativity, as fraction Skittles by design allow the creative learner the flexibility to assemble the halves together in as many ways as he can think of. And that's not all. In action and expression, a large part of improvement plan that I suggest is also just by simply varying the assessments alone. With doing that, the fraction skills address learner strengths, weaknesses, and barriers. They target all three in one just by varying the assessments. Learner weakness was described as students, they don't like to sit for long periods and like to move around the classroom. And by providing various assessments, this helps with multiple means of representation that the students would be allowed to move around depending on what they're working on. They would also be allowed freedom of movement to discuss with classmates and retrieve materials when needed. This also environment would work well for these students as the learner strengths include following the rules well. Again, learner barriers are addressed through providing multiple means of assessment and representation, which will surely aid the learner in the negative feelings towards fractions. Further, in knowing the needs of the students, I would surely implement a creative summative assessment of their learning. One idea would be for the students to trace around the base of one of the pieces of each fraction, Skittles in their math journals or on paper, on worksheets where you have questions for them and they can trace around. They can also color and label the fractions accordingly. Another idea would be to supply the students with colored construction paper. You can ask the students to use a ruler to measure and then cut the squares into equal pieces to represent the fractions, whole, halves, thirds, and fourths. And then lastly, formative assessments could be to simply talk with the student or pairs of students and incorporate questions into the conversation. The teacher can gauge student understanding through the responses to such things as, is the correct fraction Skittle handed to you? Is the student using the correct mathematical language? Or the teacher can mix the fraction Skittles up and ask the children to sort them back. You can even add a layer of difficulty by having the child be blindfolded. So those are some ways that we can also assess the students through a formative assessment there. And that's all. So thank you for taking the time to view my UDL instructional plan, and hope you find the information useful, particularly when selecting materials to use in the classroom that can address and support UDL in the classroom. Thanks so much.